Hi, Joe Paprocki from Loyola Press here to host this very exciting and engaging and fun webinar called How Star Wars Gives Voice to the Spiritual Journey, a webinar with Eric Clayton. You can see that Eric is in the house getting ready to speak to us. And Eric is no stranger to our webinars. He's been on several before. One is a solo when he talked about, not Han Solo, one is a solo when he talked about his book, Cannonball Moments. And then he was also on one of our Ignatian spirituality panels before. But today he's flying solo again with an opportunity to talk to us about Star Wars and the spiritual journey and drawing from his book, My Life with the Jedi. A couple of housekeeping details. We're in webinar mode, meaning that you won't be able to turn on your camera or unmute yourself. You'll just be hearing and seeing myself and Eric, and then a little bit later are my colleague Denise coming on to do the Q&A. Speaking of Q&A, if you have questions for Eric, and we hope you do, put them into the Q&A feature. It looks like one just popped in there now, and Denise will be sorting through those and getting them ready for the Q&A segment near the end. And finally, we are recording this, and a recording will be made available within a day or two for those of you who are participating now and anyone else who registered but couldn't be with us live. And so with that in mind, we don't want to spend another moment talking about any other details, but to get into the reason we're here today. And so first off, I want to welcome Eric. Eric, good to see you again.
Joe, always a pleasure to be with you. Thanks for having me on.
Oh, this is so much fun. I've had the pleasure of meeting you several times now in the digital world, which we know is real. Okay. And so, someday we will meet in person, but I feel like we already have. Eric Clayton is an award-winning author of, as I mentioned, one of his previous books, Cannonball Moments, about St. Ignatius and Ignatian spirituality. He's a prolific writer on pop culture, spirituality, and for his livelihood, he's the Deputy Director of Communications at the Jesuit Conference of Canada and the United States. Eric, tell us just a little bit more about yourself tells us who you are.
Well, I love Star Wars. And
Good, good start.
yeah, no, I live in Baltimore, outside of Baltimore, Maryland, and as was mentioned in this in the chat here, I'm a graduate of Fairfield University, where I studied creative writing and international studies, and I also have a graduate degree from American University and a graduate certificate from Clayton University out in Nebraska. And I spent a number of years working at Catholic Relief Services, and now I work at the Jesuit Conference in Communications, doing video and podcasts and other fun things like that. And I love working with you, Joe. Here we are talking about excellent books.
Yeah, absolutely. And you have an excellent book that Loyola Press just published called My Life with the Jedi, The Spirituality of Star Wars. And in the book, as we describe on our website, we say that you intertwine lessons learned from Star Wars universe with profound spiritual truth. So tell us what came to mind. Why did you feel compelled to write a book showing connections between Star Wars and the spiritual journey, and in particular for yourself and for our listeners and readers, the Ignatian spiritual journey?
Yeah, well, Joe, I think one of the things I've been reflecting on a lot the last couple of years, especially as I have two young kids, right, two young girls, and so we're going through kind of all the old Disney movies. We're going through a lot of nostalgic things, as well as my wife and I watch new shows and movies and read books, as anyone does. And I often reflect on how touched I am by these stories, right? These fictional stories that take place in other galaxies, other worlds, but they touch us deeply because I think these stories speak to something more than just an escape. They're really helping us to make sense of, to process our very real lives by way of an imagined world. And I think that's the beauty of pop culture. It's the beauty of these kind of stories that are almost modern myth. So Star Wars for me has always been essential to my personal canon. I said in the book and everywhere really, my dad dusted off his old VHS
Yeah,
tapes,
loved
put them
it.
in the VCR, right, 1997, something like right before the special editions came on
Yeah.
released. And away we went. I was at the right age, where it was cool to be, swinging your wrapping paper cardboard rolls around as a lightsaber, waving your hand at the grocery store. doors, and so it just stuck with me. I was like, this is really really cool. And then the Phantom Menace came out 25 years ago this year,
Wow.
and I grew up with it, right?
Yeah.
And now I have my own kids. I've always loved Star Wars. There was never really a time when I really dipped out of Star Wars, but
Hmm.
I think part of the pandemic kind of sinking into Star Wars Legos again. That was kind of a perhaps not
Hmm.
the best habit to rekindle, because I have a whole bunch of them all around me now. Um, but also a desire to pass this on to my girls really made me sink back into this particular story. And I think when we think about Ignatian spirituality and certain stories, God and all things, right? God speaking to
Yeah.
us in the stories that speak, that's God speaking to us, the stories that speak to us. Um, Star Wars is all about discerning spirits, right? Discerning between the light and the dark, between the path of the Jedi and the path of the Sith. So the parallels are right there for you. But more than just observe helpful parallels, I think what I find compelling about Star Wars and what is truly an Ignatian practice is
Mm.
to put ourselves in the scene, to put ourselves in the text, in the story, and let the story speak to us. Right?
Yeah.
That's contemplative prayer. And so, what does it? And we'll talk about this as we go. But what does it mean
Yeah.
to put myself in the dark side cave on Dagobah? What does it mean to put myself, face to face with a Palpatine like figure? And those kinds of questions can really evoke compelling spiritual nuggets, and that's what I hope to do with this book, and that's why Ignatian spirituality for me makes so much sense as a thought partner with the Star Wars franchise writ large.
Yeah, and I really love how at the beginning of your book you talk about how your dad catechized you into Star Wars, dusting off the VHS tapes and so on. And I could relate to that because I'm old enough to be your father, and so as part of my age is that I did see Star Wars in the theater when it opened in May of 1977. I had just graduated high school, and I remember going with my brothers and a couple of friends, and we were already huge Star Trek fans watching the original on TV. So we were swept away by this world. Thank you. We were swept away by the stories and how they touched us in a different way. I mean, some of the episodes of Star Trek I remember, it was the first time that the bad guys turned out not to be bad guys, that
Mm.
really the humans were the ones who were doing something wrong. There were several episodes that ended without a happy ending. And it was like, wow, what just happened here? And you'd find yourself thinking about these things. And then Star Wars came along, and so here we are. And I introduced my kids to it, but especially my son, and now he has introduced me to all of the follow-up spin-offs and so on. So just a couple of years ago, both he and my best friend Joe got me into the Mandalorian
Oh yeah.
and so on. And so my wife and I have been watching those and just enjoying. In some ways, so many of these are doing things even better than some of the originals. But you touched on this a little bit already, Eric, and let's talk a little bit more about this idea of mythology. Certainly the Star Wars universe, it welcomes us into this mythological world. And George Lucas, who founded Star Wars, was very interested in this world. Tell us a little bit about that background.
Yeah, I have a behind me here my copy of Joseph Campbell's Hero with a Thousand Faces, as well as various other kind of mythology books, and I'm fascinated by it as well. Because what I think what Campbell is arguing, and what Lucas was so drawn to, is that these stories have patterns, right? There's something that resonates deep in our own stories, our own personal life stories, that we see playing out in the sacred stories of our faith, sacred stories of religions all over the world, and then in stories of pop culture. Again, as we just look and observe, what's good storytelling? Good storytelling is good storytelling because it's true. It feels true. We see ourselves resonating with that structure. So Lucas not only was a student of mythology, but he also very intentionally made Star Wars spiritually vague because he wanted folks to find themselves in the story. He wanted folks, I think, to bring their own experiences to this story, entering into dialogue to find something that spoke to them in their unique, uniqueness, that they could bring to dialogue on the screen. And I think that's what what really works with, because the Force. What is the Force? It's very vague. I think for many years
Mhm.
there was like 10 or 12 words we had as far as definition goes, as far as what the Force is, because we wanted to all find ourselves in it. It speaks to all sorts of religious traditions. One of the things that I've been thinking about a lot with myth, right, is you have that call to adventure, right? And we know that that's how Star Wars starts. That's how Luke has to leave Tatooine, Anakin has to leave Tatooine, Rey has to leave Jakku. Um, but also we all have that invitation, we all have that call to adventure, and I think that's the spiritual life, right? That's in Ignatian tradition, I think that's Christ calling us into the exercises, and the exercises playing out against the backdrop of our own stories. So these good mythological structures aren't esoteric, out there,
Yeah.
unreachable. I think we feel them in our own stories, because I think that's God working working intimately through the story of creation.
Yeah, and I really love that you treat this subject near the beginning of the book about mythology, because I think our culture has a misunderstanding of mythology. We use the word myth to dismiss
Mm.
something. That's a myth, and we're missing the idea that while the story may not be factual, it is dealing with essential truths. And so you can't just dismiss the idea of myth. And so I really love that you brought this forward, and the idea that what we're showing on the screen here, we said that Joseph Campbell saw mythology as provider of symbols, rituals, and of course we know Star Wars is full of symbolic language and rituals. But I love the notion of to carry the human spirit forward. And here we have a wonderful sculpture of Saint Ignatius that he's almost falling over. He's leaning forward. Talk about this notion. What does that mean to carry the human spirit forward?
We need metaphor and analogy, and kind of an indirect way to speak about a very intimate experience.
Mm,
I think that's what ritual does in some ways, right? It helps us to be anchored deeply into our lived experience, while
mm,
also aware that we are not uniquely sort of solely able to make the world turn, right? We have these threshold moments that often we don't recognize until after the fact. Even those cannonball moments, right? Our favorite
yeah.
phrase in the Ignatian tradition. Sometimes we don't recognize the importance of them until well after the fact. But there are symbols and there are images and there's words in our stories, right? That prayer and reflection can bring to the fore, that I think help us to ground ourselves in reality, so that we can then keep muddling onward, even when we can't quite put our finger on it. I mean, I think in some ways it probably points to Jesus spoke in parables, right?
Yeah.
Uh, because coming at something so directly almost robs it of its deepest truth. But when you come at it in a more all-encompassing way, I wonder if we don't get a deeper sense of truth, even when it's not as literal as we may experience. I don't know.
Yeah, I think that we need a lot of times, like you're going to talk about throughout this webinar, we need a language to get into our spirituality. We often don't know how to express it. An example I think of from my own past, one of my successes that I had along the way of trying to get people to open up and talk, I did an activity with people, I still do it every once in a while, called If I Were a Church Hymn. And
Mm,
I ask people, I give them a missalette or a hymnal, and ask them to look through and pick out a church hymn that you think represents you. It's your theme song. And then we had a talk about discussion about it. And before you know it, there are people who are crying, explaining why this song means so much to them and how it's their spirituality. That never would have happened if I said, talk to us about your spirituality. Tell us, Eric, what's your spirituality? Tell us about your spiritual state right now. But we seem to need these kind of like backdoor channels, to get into it. So you emphasize and you insist that Star Wars oozes with spirituality. Tell us more about this notion.
Well, I mean, again, you think about the force. What's the force? It's an energy field that binds the galaxy together. It's this kind of mystical thing that you kind of have power over and kind of have, or kind of have an ability to enter into. But also, it's so beyond us, right? That's kind of my would be my quick take on the force. Now, the force isn't God, right? Of course not. God is intimately personal, and the force is not. But this idea of the galaxy rippling with grace, glistening with sacred energy. I think again gets to that point of, oh, well, what if that was in our real world? Oh, it is. God is in all things. All things are reflective, are resonant of something beyond, something that lifts our gaze up and beyond our own kind of grounded reality. So I think that's, out of the gate, that's where the Star Wars oozing spirituality comes from. This idea of what the Force is, and then you have these warrior monks who are tasked with maintaining peace and justice, and also with failing gloriously at that task. And I think we can easily see, certainly you can see institutionalized religion, but we can each just see ourselves, I think, in that, our own desire to be beacons of goodness, but also faltering and failing time and again. And then you have in Star Wars that constant call to hope, a constant call
Yeah.
to redemption, and that's an important piece, because I think um, that's a whole ball game when it comes to faith and spirituality. What are we hoping in, and
Mhm.
can we get better, do better, do we get another shot? And I think that's, Star Wars says yes, and certainly our faith says yes.
And I think you're also giving us a little bit of a caution as you're saying this, that there can be a danger in taking some of these mythological symbols too literally. Saying, oh, the Force, oh, so that's supposed to be God, and so on. And what you're saying is that no, it sort of points in that direction. Let's not take this too seriously, which is why I think some people dismiss the whole genre. They think that, and there are people who are fundamentalists in this genre, right? But what you're telling us is that the mythic tales just point us in a direction. They invite us to look at realities in our life. And I know in your book, then you divide up the book into several sections in which you talk about how Star Wars looks at a particular aspect that we can then find examples in to point us, to look at our spiritual lives. And the first part of the book, then you talk about naming the Phantom Menace. And so, talk a little bit about why you chose this as one of the overall overarching themes of Star Wars, and how it helps us to get into reflecting on our day-to-day lives.
Yeah, well, I mean, as you say, Joe, the book is broken into three parts, and the goal, the book has an arc to it. Where I hope that the reader enters in one place in their spiritual journey and ends in another. Hopefully, a place where they feel a little bit, maybe more grounded or deeper in their own spiritual lives. I think there's a lot of wisdom in the first. Well, we'll see how many more movies come out, but um, the beginning of the Skywalker saga, at least, being the sense of the Phantom Menace. That's what it's called, right? 25 years this year. Um, because that resonates with me as far as the spiritual life goes. We can't always name, or we don't always at first know what those things are that are kind of under our skin, right? What is it that's gnawing at us? Ignatius again invites us to discern spirits. Is it the enemy of our human nature that's whispering in our ear, or is it a good spirit? We have to know, we have to name that. If we just kind of listen to all the voices and go about our day, um, we aren't going to progress, get deeper in our own spiritual selves. So naming the Phantom Menace, of course, points to the first movie, and I share this anecdote at the very beginning of the book, that I as a fourth grader, when I was in fourth grade when the Phantom Menace released, and my friends and I are all reading all the material, that's all the magazines and
Yeah.
whatnot, about the cast, and of course you have Ian McDermott, who's cast as the Emperor, or as
Mhm.
Senator Palpatine, um, and we should have known, right? I should have known oh,
Yeah.
he's going to become the emperor.
Yeah.
He is the Phantom Menace. But for whatever reason, my fourth grade mind was like, no, absolutely not. Like that's too obvious. Or why would they do that? Or that's not part of the story. And so I think that's just a very low stakes example. But how often in our own spiritual lives do we look at ourselves, look at something that's eating away at us, and say, oh no, that's not it. That couldn't be possibly the problem or the issue. When in fact it's straight down the middle of the issue.
Yeah.
And I so that's how we have to start our spiritual journeys. And the spiritual journey isn't just like, you begin here and you end here. It's constant cyclical. You're always seeing new things, going deeper, God speaking new ways to you. So the Phantom Menace appears again and again and again. But you have to, again, look unflinchingly and name these things as best you can in community, of course.
Yeah, and I thought as I was reading about this and listening to your voice expressing these thoughts, I thought of several parallels. One is to what we can call 12-step spirituality. That you can't experience healing until you name the sin, so to speak, name the addiction. That you have to stand up in front of a group of people and say, "Hi, my name is so and so, and I am an alcoholic." You have to name the sin. I also thought about how at Mass, it's the first thing that we do is we admit our sin. We look directly and say, "I confess to Almighty God and to you, my brothers and sisters, that I have sinned greatly." And so we come face to face with the Phantom Menace as we begin our celebration of the sacred mysteries. So it was really wonderful, and I assume this is what you were hoping would happen with readers, that as they read this, they'd start to make some of these connections.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly hope so. And I think that I see there's a question here about I said in community, of course, at the end there. And Ignatius says, right, in the exercises, one of the key things he says is the enemy works in secret. The enemy works in shadow. When we say something aloud to another person, as you just described, Joe, right? I mean, that's the part of why confession is set up the way it is, right? It's because we're speaking something aloud to another person. And at Mass, as you said, um, it robs the enemy of power in that way, because it's no longer a secret. It's no longer a source
Mm,
of shame or discontent, because now it's out there. And now we all can, we all go to God together, right? So we want to make sense of who we are, where we've come from, so that we can, all progress in the spiritual life together. It's a communion of saints, right? It's not
yeah.
me by myself and the saints.
Yeah, and then you give us an example in several examples, obviously, in part one of the book, but we don't have time in a webinar for you to go through all of them. But we chose one example in each one of these parts of naming the Phantom Menace. And the first one you talk about is the image of sand, which right away I was like, duh, everything you watch on Star Wars, including till today, The Mandalorian and so on, there's always sand around. There's all these sandy planets that they're on.
Everybody
And
goes to Tatooine, yeah.
yeah, exactly. So unpack this for us a little bit. This is obviously not an accident.
Well, I'm commenting on there's like an infamous line from Attack of the Clones where Anakin says, he hates sand. It's coarse and rough and irritating. And it's a funny line. It's a stilted line, but I think it makes a lot of sense, because sand, if it's an image, right, it literally gets in our skin. It gets in places we don't want it to be, and it demands some sort of response, some sort of action. Do I want to stay in this discomfort where something seems to be calling to me? I should at the very least take a shower, right? I'm covered in sand. But I think that image is helpful for me, for our heroes here, particularly for the three main ones, right? Anakin, Luke, and Rey. The sand for me is symbolic of, hey, it's grating on you because you're being called to adventure. You're being called to something more. Now, if for those who've watched the Book of Boba Fett, the sand is purifying. He goes into the desert, and the sand kind of helps him make sense of his old life and reconcile it with his new life, right? So the sand, this image can work in different ways, but either way, it's this invitation to adventure, to deepen her understanding of self. And you can imagine someone just sitting in sand, being constantly uncomfortable, but never budging, because, oh well, this is my lot in life. I'm never going to do anything more. And I think that's not how we respond to adventure.
And of course, we look in scripture and we find some of our most epic stories take place in sand. the story of the Exodus and the people wandering through the desert for 40 years. And then we leap to the New Testament, and Jesus begins his ministry by going into the desert. And again, probably no coincidence here that Lucas and the other writers, directors, creators of Star Wars, saw that the desert, the sandy areas already are an archetype, are sort of an image, a symbol for us, and they pounced on that and used that for us. Um, as you get to the end of part one in each of the parts, then you sort of summarize what you're trying to deal with in that particular section. And so at the end of part one, you talk about embracing the awakening. And so I'm just going to read what's on there. It says, when we find ourselves trapped in darkness or self-pity, it's tempting to cast about in every direction for an exit route. We make impulsive, often ill-advised decisions. Instead, let's open our eyes to see clearly who we are and what we're about. So unpack this a little bit for us. This is kind of your summary of the whole notion of coming face to face with the Phantom Menace.
Yeah, I mean, there's that. I mean, as probably Star Wars fans can gather, each of these sections has a little bit of a pun in it, right? So this is from the idea of there's been an awakening. Have you felt it? Right. That's Snoke in the Force Awakens. And again, once we name the Phantom Menace, once we are looking clearly at those things in our lives that demand deeper interrogation, deeper investigation, deeper adventure. Then we make decisions accordingly, right? We're not just again casting about, like, oh, like who can say what comes next, let's just hope for the best. But we say, oh, actually, I've seen kind of where God is inviting me, and I now want to make those good decisions, those good choices that are going to get me closer and closer and closer to God's dream for me. And the other chapters in the section, focus, wounds, and structures, kind of all talk to things that we need to kind of again open our eyes to in some ways in our spiritual lives, and come to terms with, let go of, and move forward.
Folks, we're talking with Eric Clayton, and he's drawing from his new book, My Life with the Jedi, and helping us to see how the Star Wars universe can give us language to talk about the spiritual life. Because as we mentioned before, it's not always easy to jump right in to talking about your relationship with God, but it can be easier to talk about a movie, a story, and then draw some truths from that. We invite you to go and put any questions you have for Eric in the Q&A. I see we just got another one that entered the queue. And in about 15 minutes or so, we're going to be doing Q&A with Eric Clayton. But let's move on to the next part of the book. We've already talked now about the Phantom Menace. And now you're going to be telling us about the notion of engaging the duel of the fates. And of course, the lightsaber had to make an appearance in at least one of these images here. So tell us about the overarching theme of part two and what you're trying to help us become more aware of and to explore using Star Wars as a vehicle.
Yeah, the main point of this section, and again, kind of the opening image I use is in the Phantom Menace, again in the movie. If you think about the reemergence of the Sith, right? Darth Maul comes back, and Obi-Wan and Qui-Gon engage him kind of in the hallway of the Theed Palace there. It's an enormously consequential duel that takes place really in like a closed hallway. That no one else can see. No one else really knows the stakes that are playing out in this kind of on the other side of this doorway. I think that was kind of the way I wanted to think about again our own spiritual lives, because again we are entering into community. We are in this together. Our my spiritual life is connected to your spiritual life as God invites us to draw closer and closer to one another, to build up God's dream for our world, for all of creation, right? To reconcile creation to God. I don't want to sound like alarmist, but the stakes are high, because we want to build a world of peace and justice.
Yeah.
And so what's happening in my spiritual life necessarily should flow out of me into the world. And so I need to make sense of all this, so that I can be the person God dreams I will be, as is true for each of us.
And what do you mean by talking? You talk about the hallway of our inner lives. Tell us a little bit more about that particular image.
Yeah, no, I mean that's really just drawn right from the first movie there. But I think it's tempting to think that, oh, my spiritual life is it doesn't affect anybody but myself. I'll just kind of squirrel away here and figure it out and hope for the best, right? And in fact, like I know for me, like it's going to affect at least my children and my wife, right? Probably my parents and my brother. It's deeply personal, but also animates who we are in community. And that's why it's you have this image again in of Darth Maul engaging these two random Jedi on a random planet seemingly, and yet we know from the trajectory of the films that that is a hugely consequential duel, and that's what we're facing, right? We're trying to discern these spirits in our own lives, and what they're inviting us to do and be.
And that image that you give to us of that duel happening in that hallway, what an epic scene. We've seen that so many times. It's often pulled out as kind of representative of what Star Wars is all about. And so this notion that we are engaging in a battle, in a duel, and there are places where this particular battle takes place. You already mentioned that hallway, but then you chose to focus on another image that is very powerful in the Star Wars universe, and that is the notion of caves. And you say that we all must travel that cold, dark path into our inner caves. What do we take with us? So tell us why you chose this notion of caves, and what do you mean about what do we need to take with us?
Well, I mean, it comes right from the Dark Side Cave on Dagobah, right? A very powerful scene, and one that I use very often when I'm thinking about kind of spirituality in Star Wars. And just briefly, right? Let's put ourselves in that scene. Finishes his day of Jedi training, and he passes this cave. He's like, "Man, it's cold over there. What's in there?" And Yoda says, "In you must go." And Luke says, "Well, what's in there?" And Yoda says, "Only what you take with you." And what does Luke take with him? He goes into the cave, and he encounters, of course, the vision of Vader. And he says, "What does he take with him?" His lightsaber, even though Yoda says you don't need any weapons. And he ignites the blade and goes to defeat Vader. He strikes him down. Spoiler alert: the head falls off, the mask explodes. And instead of this sense of I defeated evil, I won the battle, Luke sees himself. What does he bring into the cave? He brings in a sense of I am not enough. I am not enough to meet the moment. And he also brings in his cave this sense of where what he thinks his lot in life is. He thinks he has to defeat this evil. When in fact, what does he actually do? He engages in nonviolence and he redeems Vader, right? It ends up not being a duel, a battle. It ends up being a and it is this, I mean, not to drag the parallels out, but what does Ignatius do in a cave? Ignatius is in a cave too. What does he do? He also is struggling with that sense of shame. I am not enough to meet this moment, even though it's in that cave that he writes the exercises. So I think we all have these places where we say, oh man, I'm not enough. I can't do it. We bring our own biases, our own proverbial lightsabers in, thinking, oh, I gotta fight this thing. When in fact, God is inviting us to imagine something completely different. But if we go in, with armed to the teeth or ready to just do it our way, we miss it. And I think that's a large part in what the Dark Side Cave actually shows us, at least in The Empire Strikes Back.
You just hit me with that notion of Ignatius himself going into a cave. How I missed that when I was reading this part, I didn't make that connection. I've been to the cave in
Read it again, Joe.
Manresa,
Read it again.
and it's like what an amazing part of Ignatius's journey is that this is the place where he goes in kind of as one person and he emerges as another person, and so that cave is symbolic of the transformative places that we dwell in, and sometimes there are places of darkness where we may not be seen very clearly. And in fact, the story tells us that some people came to warn Ignatius that he was kind of going off the deep end while he was in the cave, growing his hair real long and not cutting his fingernails. And they were like, "Okay, come on, guy." And so that period of darkness can be a time of confusion, can be a time of sadness and fear as well. But to work through that and then to emerge into the light. So thanks for making that connection. And I'm going to have to read that section again and just recall the whole notion of the cave at Manresa. So you summarize part two by talking about darkness rises and light comes to meet it. And of course, light and darkness are all over our scripture, and many of the stories that we have in scripture and in so many other genres of our literature. How does Star Wars use this notion of darkness and light and the notion of light meeting the darkness?
Again, that's a line from Last Jedi. Again, I think it's Snoke again, right? And you have that image. I think if you know the scene, kind of that epic duel. Kylo Ren representing the darkness, Rey representing the light. But they're fighting together. They're at odds, then they're together, then they're at odds, then they're together. And there's this interesting kind of dance. And I think that's what happens in each of us, right? There's darkness, there's light, and we discern these spirits and become the person God invites us to be. What I found a wonderful quote from one of the writers or producers of Empire Strikes Back, who was reflecting on reading the script after George Lucas had written it, and he's like, he jokes, he makes this deduction that this is part two of a trilogy, because things end poorly, right? Things end poorly, and if you look at each second film of each of the trilogies, things end poorly for our heroes. But because it does that, because they end on a low note, it's a deeper investigation of character. It invites us to go deeper into ourselves and to discern, okay, well, actually, who am I in this moment? Who am I when I'm in the cave? I'm in the pressure cooker of the cave. And who is God really inviting me to be? Which spirits are whispering in my ear, and which am I listening to as a result? So I think that's I think we find ourselves in this moment quite a lot.
And I really felt that this summary you did of part two paved the way beautifully to your introduction of part three, because you're talking about discerning a new hope. And so when you're talking about, light meeting the darkness, it's so easy to just give into the darkness and just say, oh, you can't win, and just be fatalistic. I have a friend of mine I laugh on Facebook. He's a Cubs fan, and anytime the other team scores a run, he goes right on and he says, "Oh, forget it. They're going to lose this game." It's like, okay, it's the first inning. They're down 1-0. He's already changing channels. We can be fatalistic. That's obviously a very light example that I use, but sometimes we can approach life that way and just think that darkness wins out. You talked in part two about light meeting that darkness, and then in part three, you take it further. You talk about the notion of discerning a new hope. So, welcome us into part three of your book.
Hope demands action. Hope is the whole ball game, first of all, right? We're talking about faith, we're talking about, you're looking at the world today. Hope is the whole ball game. But we don't just sit and hope, like, just squeeze our fists together in our prayer chair. We have to then live out the hope in very small but tangible ways. And again, it comes to discern, what is God inviting me to do now? Who am I invited to be and to become? I am not a medic. I'm not a surgeon. That's not the thing I'm meant to do. Although what good work that is. I write stuff, and I hope that my little contribution does some good, some cascading good. With discern who we are, so that we can do the work of hope in our daily lives.
Folks, we're talking with Eric Clayton. Obviously, if you've been with us through about Star Wars and the spiritual life and how Star Wars gives us language for talking about our spirituality, we're about 5-10 minutes away at most from Q&A. And I can see that the Q&A queue is filling up. And so please put any questions you have in there for Eric. And so I won't take up any more time. Let's get into the example that you use in part three to talk about this. You invite us to explore the notion of redemption, and of course, a huge theme in Star Wars and a huge theme in our spirituality.
And I love that picture. It's a hilarious photo.
I thought you'd like that. I mean, it's very real, isn't it?
I mean, redemption, I think on the one hand, you look at Star Wars and like, oh, Vader, Kylo Ren, the last minute they make one good choice, they're redeemed. And that's true to life, right? We are allowed to make one good choice, and God, we're always the beloved of God, of course. God loves us. But I think there are more interesting stories right now in the Star Wars universe about people working out redemption. Because again, like if you think of Andor, if you look at the TV show Andor, you know, Rebel has something bigger to hope in than a stormtrooper, right? Because they're trying to build something, imagine something. And all of his choices are not good ones. He makes morally incorrect choices. If you're watching the show, he kills people, he takes advantage of people. And yet he keeps trying to kind of, if you think about life as like the bumpers on a bowling alley. He's just trying to, he keeps bumping back into, the center of the lane to try and get to the finish line. What are we trying to do? And I think that shows us redemption. Also, I mean, I know I mentioned the Bad Batch earlier. It's probably a little more niche than folks on this webinar are watching. But there's another great character, Crosshair, who he makes all the wrong choices, and then the second half of the final season is forced to reckon with those choices, but more importantly, reckon with the relationships, right? Rebuild and restore relationships and his sense of self. And I think that's what Star Wars is pushing a lot of these folks, these characters towards, and reminding us that we can as well.
And it's so important here that you put a good emphasis on the need for us to leave room for the redemption of others. It's not just, our
Mm-hmm.
own redemption, but, and you talk a lot about how, Luke is continually looking to find the good in Darth Vader. And how in our own lives, we can be wronged by someone and we're like, that's it, they're off the list. In fact, my wife and we use that phrase, sometimes as an exaggeration. Someone will do
Off the
something, they'll
Christmas
say
list.
they're off the list. Um, and yet I have a friend of mine he's always seen that possibility for redemption. I just told him about a situation in which a friend wronged me. I think it's all kind of healing up now. He said, well, next time you see him, you should probably take over a beer and just sit down. And I'm like, you always do that to me. I can't just take him off the list, It's like you want him back on the list so we can sit and have a beer. So I love the way you talk about this, and then you bring it to a wonderful summary to summarize all of part three. In the question, what chance or what choice? So tell us what you were thinking as you tried to bring all of this to a nice little ending and tie it in a nice bow.
Yeah, just briefly, because I know we want to get to questions, but I mean, there's that scene in Rogue One when Jyn Erso says, what chance or what choice, right, in response to the Empire, the overarching evil of the Empire. Um, we can leave things up to chance and hope things work out, right? It's just kind of squeezing our hands together and not doing the work of hope, or we can choose to say, hey, you know what? I'm going to do my part. I'm going to discern the spirits. I'm going to figure out what God's inviting me to do. I'm going to enter into community, and I'm going to do something to bring about God's dream in this world. And that's a decision we make, as opposed to just saying, "Well, I hope it all works out." And those are markedly different ways of living life. And again, you see that play out in Star Wars.
It does. One last thing I'd like to touch on, because we do want to get to the Q&A, so I'm going to skip over one part. If you really want to go back to it, go ahead. But I do want to end our conversation here about this notion where you deal with the fact that Star Wars is about wars, and so obviously there's violence involved. And some people might think, well, how can you write a book about spirituality when this whole genre is about wars and blowing up planets and killing people? Your thoughts on that? You deal pretty seriously with that.
Yeah, no, I was exactly where I came to at the conclusion of the book, and throughout, really, it's always kind of a pestering question.
Mm.
I mean, we live in the real world, right? There is a lot of conflict right now. Look around us, right? And so I think there's that challenge: is there a third way? And I think we see that in Star Wars. I think most clearly in the Last Jedi, when Luke, projects himself to Crate from Octu. There's never actually a threat of violence when Luke shows up. And yet it's interesting that so many people were upset with that as the outcome to the film, right?
Mm.
But Luke quite literally gives of self, sacrifices himself, his kind of lived experience to do that in a nonviolent way to allow the resistance to hope, to continue to hope, and to give Kylo Ren space to find redemption. I mean, I don't know if Luke actually showed up. Do you think Kylo Ren would have defeated him, or do you think Luke would have ended that storyline right then and there?
Yeah.
So there's, are we giving space for creative energy to continue to flow, for God to continue to work? And I think that's what invites us to step back. Again, Star Wars, again, we have to reflect real life. There's conflict, there's war, there's violence, there's
Yeah.
suffering. But it doesn't mean we have to be super excited, every time a TIE fighter explodes.
Yeah, and I couldn't help but think of, how often it becomes our human nature to turn to violence, because it seems like we'll see a result. We're not so sure if we do nonviolence, what's going to happen. And it just seems to me it brings us back to the story of the Passion, and when Pilate gave people the choice between Barabbas and Jesus. We tend to choose Barabbas, and because, in fact, I've often referred to that as the Barabbas cycle. That
Mm.
when something happens, we turn to Barabbas to return fire with a bigger lightsaber, so to speak, right? And so you really gave us something to think about at the end of this book. I appreciate you doing that, as you did through the whole book. What you did was you gave us opportunities to take some themes from this genre, from the Star Wars universe, and deal with some really difficult issues, some of them on a personal level and some on a global issue. And I just think you did a marvelous job with this, Eric, and I compliment you on the book. I'd love to get to Q&A unless there's anything else you wanted to squeeze in there, Eric.
No, let's do it. I'm sure there's a lot of good questions. I'll be happy to take a
Excellent.
crack at a few of
So
them.
good. So there's Denise. Welcome back, Denise. And it does look like she has a full queue of questions. And so I will turn it over to you, Denise, and you just keep chatting with Eric there until it looks like I need to jump back in. So I'm just going to mute myself, kind of.
All right. So Maureen says she teaches her students a lesson called May the Force Be With You, using Star Wars themes and how it relates to the force of the Holy Spirit, and would love for you to share some ideas about that connection.
Yeah, I'd love to know more about exactly how what that entails. That sounds really interesting. I know there's a great essay by a Jesuit at Marquette, Ryan Duns, in a book called Theology or something to that effect, where he actually talks about those two, Holy Spirit and the Force. And I think it's a very useful analogy. But also he makes clear, like, don't forget, right? The Holy Spirit. What's the difference? The Holy Spirit is intimately concerned with our well-being. The Spirit delights in us. We are the beloved. Where I wouldn't say that's the same in the Force, right? The Force isn't personal, at least so far as we've been led to believe in the Star Wars canon. But the idea that the Force is in all things and binds everything together, I think, really is a powerful image for what God is, right? And of course, the Spirit binding the world, present in all things, but just so intimately present that it is in creation itself, manifesting through creation. So I think there's a lot of richness to mine in that comparison.
Great. Mitchell says, you freely discuss Star Wars material interchangeably between the original 6 films and then the later material to the canon. What do you make of the fact that some of these later Star Wars elements are telling a different story than the George Lucas originally intended, and even telling a different story from itself sometimes because of the different directors and producers?
Yeah, I will confess to not being as kind of well read on kind of like, what was Lucas's intent and where is it diverged. I know Dave Filoni, who's kind of at the head of Star Wars in a lot of ways, is a real disciple of Lucas, studied under him, and there's definitely a through line there. I think one of the things that I really like about Star Wars, and I think there's a spiritual lesson here too, is that sometimes they drop story beats kind of on you that came from nowhere, and you're like, oh, there's more here. And an example I would give is, when you show up in the theater, you watch The Force Awakens, and Leia, General Organa, comes off that shuttle, and you see her interaction with Han Solo, and you're like, oh, they were married, they're not anymore, something happened, but there's no answers given. and you're like, okay, there's more story here that they're going to tell us. They're going to fill in the blanks. And that you could be cynical and say that's a real marketing tactic, or you could say, wow, that's life. That this sense of there's always more story, and if we are engaging one another, there's more to the story is going to unfold more and more, and it doesn't always unfold in a linear way. We learn something new that informs what we do in the present, from the past, and so there's that cascading nature of it. Again, I know there's kind of discourse around what Lucas intended. I don't know that as well, so I can't speak to it. And I do know that there is some kind of missteps in canon, and I think there's a little bit of like what's in your head canon versus what's actually on the page. How do you reconcile it? It's kind of like scripture in some ways when you're looking at 4 different gospel accounts and you're getting different angles that bring the story to life in a larger way. Even if chapter 1 of the Mandalorian isn't quite what what Chuck Wendig said in the Aftermath trilogy. There's some deep cut references.
Thank you. Now switching directions a little bit here with some of these questions. Joanna is looking at doing a book club with teens this summer with My Life with the Jedi.
Excellent.
Do you think that would be good as an age range for the book?
Yeah, I think so. Probably like juniors and seniors, right, in high school. That would probably be good. I would make sure people like Star Wars. I think that would probably be more important than age range. But yeah, I think that's great. I'd be happy to talk, with the group if that's helpful.
Wonderful. And then you mentioned it's helpful to, like Star Wars, of course. One of our anonymous attendees says that she's begun reading the book, but already finds many of the Star Wars characters are maybe unknown or not remembered by this particular reader. Would you recommend watching the movies again to refresh characters, or can we just enjoy the book and understand it without the deep character knowledge that you have?
So I wrote the book really hoping, and I know that my very good editors at Loyola Press helped me with this. It hopefully should be accessible to anybody. Even if you don't know Star Wars at all. Like, let's say you go in, you might not enjoy it as much, but you should be able to read the book and understand all the points and get enough of the story. Even if you aren't familiar with every beat in the whole franchise, that was intentionally done. You can tell me I did not succeed, and that's fine. But that was my hope. Because I do have a lot of kind of, again, deep references all across the saga. For folks that are well versed in Star Wars, there's something for you. But if you just watch 1 or 2 of the films, you have fond nostalgic memories of it, this should also be for you too. And I think even for folks that just want to see, how do I deal with pop culture, with a story of pop culture through the lens of spirituality, almost as a case study being Star Wars, this could work for you too. It's written hopefully with that in mind. That said, I do think you have to like Star Wars at the very least in order to get to the end.
And I'll interject here just for a second. I think that's kind of where I find myself. I'm a Star Wars fan, but I have nowhere near the knowledge that you have, Eric. And I've just sort of been getting back into it again because my son talking about the Mandalorian and then sort of going back and saying, oh, you should watch this, you should watch that, and so on. But I found it very easy to go through your book. And even if I didn't know the character, you explain it for the reader. And I think you did a good job on helping us to say, okay, man, I may not be able to put a name with a face, but I understand what you're talking about here. And so maybe I'll go back and Google the character just to see the face. Oh, yeah, that's who he's talking about. Okay, I think we have time for at least one more, possibly 2, Denise.
Okay. So Barbara is looking at it from the Ignatian spirituality side specifically, and says she's reminded, when you're talking about the duel of the fates and some of these scenes, of the 2 standards meditation.
Oh, yeah.
Could you comment?
Yes, agreed. There's a whole chapter on that. On the 2 that's how part 2 ends. Because I think I'm actually giving a paper tomorrow or Saturday at a conference on the 2 standards in Star Wars. Because it's inherently there. It's the rule of 2 of the Sith, right? It's 2 there should be no more nor less. 1 to embody power, the other to crave it is I think the standard of the enemy. And that's what I talk about in one of the chapters. So yes, you will definitely see that in there. And I could talk a lot more on that, but I maybe bring another question or 2 in there. But feel free to email me.
Can I toss in a follow-up on that? So one of the previous questions was how much knowledge of Star Wars do you need to have? How much knowledge of Ignatian spirituality do you need to have, or the spiritual exercises?
Same deal. It's written for folks. This could, my hope, right? My great hope would be if you are a Star Wars fan, but perhaps you're a little suspicious of religion or faith, or you had a bad experience in the past, but you love Star Wars. This book gets you into it and gives you a language. You say, oh, you know what? Actually, maybe I never thought of faith life in this way. I want to learn more. Right? Entry into spirituality. This might be again, you're Joe Propaca, you're a Star Wars kind of a fan, but you know a lot about Ignatian spirituality. This book hopefully will give you a lot more Star Wars stuff to go and check out, because you went in the door of Ignatian spirituality. And maybe you're kind of, you went to a Jesuit school, you work at a Jesuit organization, you know some of the words, some of the lingo, but you want to know more. You also happen to like Star Wars. This book will give you a great overview of both. That was my intent. Those are the audiences I had in mind writing this book.
Great, I appreciate that. Denise, you have another good one that you can toss to Eric?
Yeah, and I think this is probably a great way to close, because it pulls some of these things together. Um, Michael asks, do you see parallels to our faith in any other well-known book or movie franchises? Perhaps The Lord of the Rings, for instance. And since you're integrating spirituality with Star Wars, we can do this with other elements, right?
Oh, absolutely. Yes, I do. I mean, if you want to, I do a Substack where occasionally I write on that topic. Yes, Lord of the Rings for sure. Like you could talk about, you could use Ted Lasso, you could use the bear. I just gave a presentation a couple weeks ago about pulling on a lot of these different things, looking at myth, going in through the lens of myth, but ending in spirituality and faith life, and pulling on these different themes. Again, I think it all in Narnia, yeah, of course. I think because again, good storytelling is good storytelling because it resonates with our own lived story. You use the mythic structure, which I think is in Ignatian spirituality in the format of the exercises. If you want to do any of these things, you can. I wrote about Bluey for NCR this last week, and kind of where you see desolation in that. So I mean, 100% yes.
Well, and Denise, you may have just sown the seed for another book and webinar to follow as part of a series that Eric will just continue to take some of these pop culture genres and explore spirituality. So good for that. Denise, thank you for bringing the questions to Eric. Eric, can't thank you enough for this time we spent. I always wish we had more time because you're a joy to listen to, and you make our faith life so accessible. And I think one of the ways that you're doing that now through this book is by drawing us to make connections with pop culture. We're surrounded by it. We're inundated with it. And Ignatian spirituality says we can find God in all things. We should be able to find God in pop culture as well. So your closing words as we wrap this up and send people to read your book.
Yeah, I appreciate people tuning in, and thank you for Joe for your moderation, and Denise for the handling the questions. And I just want to affirm what folks are saying in the chat here. Dune, Star Trek, God is in all those things, right? And we can allow God to speak to us through those stories that move us. I always say to folks, maybe Star Wars isn't your thing. What is your story? Because that's where God is trying to speak to you. And so let the Spirit work in that way.
Wonderful. And again, thank you, Eric, so much for writing the book, for taking the time to be with us on this webinar. I look forward to the next webinar we do together, whenever and whatever that may be.
For sure. Thanks, Joe.
Thank you. And thank you to all of you who tuned in to spend time with us in this webinar. The book is called My Life with the Jedi, The Spirituality of Star Wars by Eric Clayton. There's a QR code on the screen for you right now if you want to scan that and take you right to the Loyola Press site about the book. You could also go online to visit the Loyola Press website, store.loyolapress.com. You can call our 800 number, 800-621-1008. And if you call during business hours, you will speak to a real live human being. And then once again, a reminder that a recording will be available soon at ignatianspirituality.com. So thank you once again, Eric, and to everyone for joining us today. This is Joe Paprocki from Loyola Press. Until next time, God bless.
And may the force be with you.
May the force be with you.